Hello, and welcome to Mangasplaining Extra, the show where we don't recommend great manga to folks who haven't read manga before, but instead talk to people who work in the manga industry about making manga and everything that comes along with it. Hosted usually by Deb Aoki, David Brothers, Christopher Woodrow Butcher, that's me, and Chip Zdarsky. It's just Deb and I here today. You can follow along with our show notes and reading list at mangasplaining.com. And this week, we have two very special guests on the podcast. Yes, it's one of our very rare, once or twice at most per season interview episodes. We're so delighted to have our friends, Abby and Matt, here. Normally, I would... You know what? Actually, I will. And then, of course, as Deb is here. Deb, how you doing today?
I'm doing great. It's so nice to see you both here. I heard... I'm so excited to talk to you about your books. I just got finished reading all of them.
Literally everything all at once. That's great. For those of you who don't know who Abby and Matt are, Abby Denson is a writer, creator, traveloguer extraordinaire who's been artist, teacher. Like you're doing all the things. Who's been working in the industry for a couple of years and who I've known for a really long time. And I followed their work since I was a teenager myself, actually, which is pretty cool. We were like this, must have been the same age, which is wild. And their newest books, well, we'll talk about that in a second. And Matt Loux, I mispronounced his name the first time I met him. And it is Matt Loux and not Matt Loux, as I have a tendency to over-Canadianly pronounce every word I come across that looks remotely foreign. Matt, I became aware of his work on Side Scrollers for Oni Press like a million years ago, and now he has just created an amazing kids book called Prunella, and they're a couple. Oh my God, you guys are a couple. How do you feel about that? How do you feel about being our first married podcast guests, not counting Matt Alt and Patrick Macias, who are kind of like spiritually married?
See.
Actually, you know what? Let's.
Oh, that's the real first question.
It was, but here, why don't you actually?
Oh, sorry, that was part of the intro.
No, I gave a very personal. Who are you guys? But I feel like you're pros. Why don't you give me like the Comic-Con? Give us the Comic-Con spiel at the beginning of a panel discussion. Who are you, and why are all these delightful people here assembled to see you today?
Okay, I guess I'll go first. So I'm Abby Denson, and I've been making comics over 20 years, I think, but time, shifts in interesting ways. I started out doing DIY, self-published comics that were then published in XY Magazine, which was a gay youth magazine of the time. And then I also got into writing for licensed books such as Powerpuff Girls and Amazing Spider-Man Family and Sabrina the Teenage Witch, things like that for various publishers. But I also, was really still wanting to do my own work. So I have some other books like Dolltopia and more recently the Kitty Sweet Tooth book series, which was a collaboration with Japanese artist Udomaru. And I have 3 books I wrote and drew about Japan out from Tuttle. So there's Cool Japan Guide, Cool Tokyo Guide, and Uniquely Japan. All in a mouthful. Hopefully that'll give you an idea.
It's awesome. Yeah. Your work in XY Magazine is where I first encountered it. I want to talk a little bit about that, but let's first introduce Matthew. Matthew. What are we going to do this episode? Because I call you. Matt's fine.
Oh, Matt, it's fine. Usually, yeah. Like when I interact with humans, it's Matt. But like for my title on books, it's Matthew. But either one's fine, honestly. So yeah, my name is Matthew Loux. That's a very American way of pronouncing that last name. I've been doing comics since about the mid-aughts. My first work was with Oni Press. I did a book with Anthony Johnston for my first book with them, and then I did my own stories. So like you said, Side Scrollers was the first one. Then I did a kids series with them. My first kids series was called Saltwater Taffy, and we did 5 books of that. That was a very fun, kind of an adventure, Hardy Boys-esque kids adventure on a vacation with like local sea monster folklore of New England, which is where I grew up. So kind of a little bit of a throwback to, my brother and myself. And then I started working with First Second. I do a series called The Time Museum. I've done 2 volumes of that, and I'm working on the 3rd one right now. That's kind of like a fun time travel kind of adventure. And the book that I most recently did is a fantasy story called Prunella and the Cursed Skull Ring. And that came out pretty recently. And also from First Second. That's my first fully hand painted book, like all done by hand, like almost everything except for some editing and the actual letters for the lettering.
That's very cool, both of you. Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast. And I want to go back, Abby. I want to start. Yeah, your work comics were some of the first like queer comics that I even came across. Like as a young person who was reading XY magazine back in the day, I would flip it open and I'm like, oh, there's comics in this, because comics weren't anywhere. They were like, the Transformers and G.I. Joe stuff and like X-Men that I collected obsessively as a teen, looking for like any kind of queer representation. And then I moved to the I didn't even move to the big city. I snuck off to the big city on my lunch hours from like the suburbs. I would like borrow my mom's car and be like, oh, it'd be easier if I drove today, Mom. And it's like, no, I'm going downtown. I'm like driving for an hour to get downtown and skipping one of my, like the period after lunch, just so I can go to Tower Records and buy XY magazine, because it was too scary to go to the gay village. But I could go to Tower Records and get like the cool magazines that were imported from the States. And coming across your work there was so cool to me.
Thank you. Yeah, they had good distributions to Tower Records. I think that they were in Tower in New York, and also I think in Tower Japan, which is how I did get some other. I have a few Japanese pen pals from that, so it was a really cool, distribution system. But yeah, so the story behind that is I was in college. It was the first real comic I ever drew. I had started getting into manga, but I was already kind of not so interested in the action and sci-fi manga that was available in the mid 90s. But I was like, I really loved Maizani Koku and Ranma but I also, my favorite artist is Keith Haring. And I feel like if you look at my art, you can see both of those influences, Rumiko Takahashi and Keith Haring. But that was kind of what my first comic looked like a little bit. And I had absolutely, even though I was studying illustration in college, I had no comic art training. I just like to read comics and manga. So but I was into punk. I was in punk bands and I was into zines. So I knew how to make a zine, and I wanted it to make like a zine that was kind of a punk comic, but I wanted it to be a gay teen romance. And the reason for that is that, I come from like, I have like my dad's gay, my uncle's gay, my friends in school were gay. I have gay family. I have gay friends. It was part of my life. And I also was interested in the Shonen Ai manga, like that was not translated, but I could start to see and was hearing about. And I was like,
oh my God, me too.
I wanted to make something. And I was like, I want to make something like that, but it was almost impossible to get. I could see what was in the Fred Schotes book, Manga, which is like a formative work for a lot of people. Since you could also see Rosa Versailles was in there. That was like, I think the only place it was published in English for a very long time for parts of it. But it did have segments of, I believe they had Song of Wind and Trees in it, some Keiko Takamiya's work. And that was like really enticing to me. And I was like, I want to make something like this, but I also have my own real life experience of, what is going on with American gay people around me. And I wanted to try to make something that was a little bit like that. It reflected, even though it was a total fantasy.
I kind of love that. Yeah, but you probably had more experience with real life gay people than anyone making Shonen Ai manga in Japan at the time. Like, not to be super rude about it, but like, yeah, they were like, gays were kind of unicorns to a lot of them. And it was all like, it was the boarding school stuff of the late 70s and early 80s. And then like the gritty, secretly gay cops in New York and like fake. And, what's that one, Deb, that just came out that Yen just put out? It's like a classic.
It's New York by Marimo Ragawa.
Yeah, that just came out. And that's like Mark, who works at Yen, who released it in English, was just telling me about that when I was like this like lost classic of like hardcore, gritty, early Shonen Ai kind of manga. Have you read it? Is it any good? Should we put it on the podcast? I don't even know.
It's pretty melodramatic. And it's
okay.
It's very 80s in vibe.
Gotcha.
It's interesting. It's worth a read. A little side note about that is that Marimo Ragawa did a manga called Baby and Me. And so, which is a really charming story about a young boy raising his younger brother.
Oh, was that a Shoujo Beat title?
Indeed, yes.
Like a Viz title? Oh, okay, yeah, I saw that. That was always so weird. They drew that baby so weird. Sorry,
but like
we're
Mark
getting-
like also does like BL type work too, right? And then
Yeah.
does her current series is the Snow White Notes about shamisen players. Like,
oh, you've talked about that a couple
which I
times.
love a
You really
lot.
like that one, yeah? Oh.
Yeah, it's really fascinating because there's a whole period of manga, right, that's never been published in English because it was before like 1990, and that was one of them.
Yeah, it's on my list for sure, but I almost had to imagine what what was out there at the time because you couldn't really get it, and you certainly couldn't get it in English. Still can't for a lot of these. That's what was the inspiration behind me making my first story and my first comic, and
your secret origin story.
My secret origin, and then I saw XY magazine, which was a magazine with lots of handsome guys. On the shelves, and I bought it, and I was like, oh, let me just send them my comic and see if they'll. And I like hand wrote a letter. I was like, here's my comic for you to review, or maybe you can run it. And
wow.
They actually called me.
Fortune favors the bold.
Yeah, so they called me, and then like we worked it out, and I actually, instead of having a part-time job, I like did it, and I got paid, and I did the comic for them for like. It went in for like 2 years, but I think it ran for 2 years in there. But that's the story of how that initially happened. So, and then luckily, fortunately, Chris read it and many others that I wouldn't have expected. And that the other secret origin of this was a the mini comic is how I met my good friend Yuko Koyama, who I went on to collaborate with and who became my first like very close pen pal in Japan. And it resulted in us exhibiting a comic market together in 1997.
Oh, wow.
So because the comic came out in like 96, it was a mini comic. Her and her sister came to New York, and I was putting it in punk record stores and different comic shops. They went to Other Music, which is like a famous indie rock store. But there's a documentary about the story on Amazon, I think. And I guess Yuko's sister saw it and was like, hey, there's a comic here. And then Yuko got it. She bought it, took it to Japan, and then we became pen pals, and we now are still great friends, and we're hanging out a couple weeks ago. And this is over 20 years long going. Making my first comic was like really pivotal to many parts of my life up to now, like my friendships and my creative lifestyle and everything.
Oh, it's awesome. It's funny too, because I'm actually in Tokyo right now, and you and Deb like missed each other, like ships in the night. Actually, while you were, it's like, yeah, but I've seen both of you. I've seen all three of you guys recently, and it's like, oh yeah, but you didn't see each other. You didn't quite cross over during your. It's funny, like everybody is making their like first, or in Deb's case, second or third trip back to Japan after the long international nightmare. Yeah, it's nice. How did you? I know Deb had a pretty good time and a busy time too. How did you guys enjoy your last trip? Was it like everything you'd been dreaming of for 3 years, or?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, you guys go back before the pandemic. You were going back at least once a year or more.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that actually, let's stay with you then, Abby, because that brings us to you had to come back every year because you were writing books about Japan. Abby wrote the cool Tokyo guide, the cool Japan guide, and then just came out with Uniquely Japan just like a couple months ago, right?
Yes, and the story behind those books is not that different from the story of Tough Love, which is I made a mini comic with Yuko, who I had just mentioned, my good friend Yuko Koyama. Check out her stuff, Water M. Leon. That's her Twitter.
We'll have links in the show notes. It'll be fine. Everyone can check it out.
Yeah. We made some mini comics together and collaborated, and she actually exhibited at TCAF with me. I exhibited with her. We had traveled to Angoulême together. We've actually done a bunch of things together. However, we made a mini comic together that was about food, and I had a part about Japanese food, and she did half of it about American food. And I went to a kind of like a little convention about food publishing that was in New York many years back. And Tuttle had a table there, and I just made conversation with Christopher Johns, who is an awesome guy who I worked with there for a long time. And I just gave him my mini comic, and then he was like, oh, you should do a book for us. So, hey, everybody, do make mini comics. This is how you get published. Anyway, that's my experience.
Amazing.
Yeah, wow. What was it? No, we'll come back. We'll come back to that. I'll write that down to remember to come back to it later. Which brings us, Matthew, what is your secret origin story? Because I was friends with the Oni Press guys, and they're like, oh, we got this cool young kid who's doing stuff for us now. And it was like, they always talked about you like you were maybe still in high school or something while you were making the comics for them. It's like, yeah, he's this young guy and he's coming up, and I'm like, how young are we talking? Like, is he doing this on his lunch break, or what's the deal? But I assume you had perhaps graduated like art school or something before you started working for Oni.
Yeah, by quite a bit. I have a young looking face, so that's hilarious. But yeah, that was my first professional gigs was with Oni. It was the early Oni days too, like not the earliest Oni days. So I did go to art school. I went to School of Visual Arts in Manhattan, in New York City. Went for the 4 years. I did not major in cartooning though. I majored in illustration, and I pretty much just did that because I wanted to learn how to just be a better painter and a better artist. I, like a lot of kids probably, I naively didn't even think about what my career might be afterwards. While I was there, they do have a very famous cartooning department, and I made friends with a lot of people that went to the cartooning classes, and I started taking a few of the classes, but not a lot of major ones. And it wasn't until I graduated where I was reading a lot of stuff, a lot of Oni Press. I was really impressed by, the late 90s indie scene was kind of like a unique. Back then, it's kind of hard to remember. Even the kids' comics that we have now, It just wasn't around. Or honestly, it was almost non-existent, other than just Archie or a few things. Certainly not the way it exists now. And the only other alternative is really direct market Marvel DC kind of style. And I just I didn't really draw like that. Like wasn't that interested in drawing the hyper muscly realistic guys. But then I saw things like Oni where I was like, oh, I can kind of draw like that, because it's like they're doing interesting stories, but then there's like Scott Chandler, who's doing sort of a cartoony, look to his characters, or like Scott Morse, who has this kind of like animation background and has this really exciting like look to his inking. And I'm like, that I feel like I kind of fit into that. So that was kind of like my North Star. And I was able to kind of get in with them. It was great. I was really lucky and very happy. Like I said, I was able to. I did a book with another writer first, and then I pitched them my own idea. It was just kind of like right after the first Scott Pilgrim came out, and I think that helped my case, because it was kind of about a bunch of slackers who played video games. They're like, I think this is a winning formula for us, so let's try it. It was really fun to be around everybody during that time, and it was fun making stuff, and it was like. It felt kind of DIY. They didn't publish almost anything in color yet, so we're all doing like kind of indie stuff. It was super fun, and everybody there was great. It was a lot of fun. Yeah, that's kind of the comic origin. I did do some minis, but not as many minis as a lot of people do. I kind of did a few, kind of got on Oni's radar. I got permission to kind of submit stuff, and eventually they're like, "Hey, you want to do this book?"
You didn't really have time to do a lot of minis. You were like. You were a very young guy who was coming up, and they were just scooping you up to try and put you on series right away. So I always found that really fascinating.
Yeah.
What was the name of the book you did with Anthony, by the way? I maybe blanked on that one.
It was F-Stop.
Right.
F-Stop. It was kind of like a photography, a guy who wants to be a photographer, but he's terrible at it. But his bad photos suddenly become like super in vogue, and it almost becomes kind of like he becomes kind of like a flavor of the week kind of thing. It goes to his head, but then he realizes, oh, I suck, and I want to actually become a good photographer. So it was a cool story.
Oni kind of had this reputation of being kind of manga adjacent, right? Like it had this of all the indie publishers, was kind of like they didn't exactly publish manga, but they published manga that was appealing to manga readers. Like there was a little overlap. Is that kind of partly where you came from, or?
Yeah, absolutely. Like many kids my age who grew up in the 80s, I read, Snoopy comics, like Peanuts comics. My grandmother used to get like ones from the yard sale, like collections from yard sales, and I loved them. Garfield, the kind of stuff you would get at the Scholastic Book Fair. The only thing that everyone else my age was into that I never read was Calvin and Hobbes. I love the art, but I just never read it growing up. And then I also loved superhero stuff. But then around high school is when I got exposed to anime and manga. I had a very good friend named Steve Uwe, who was actually a cartoonist. He's done stuff for Aftershock and a few other places. And he was the kind of guy who was like, Q's the pusher. He was like, okay, like I'm too lazy and don't have the wherewithal to kind of find this stuff, nor do I have enough money to buy, all the extremely expensive VHS tapes from Suncoast Videos. But he like would rent them from the local comic shop and then make copies, and then we would watch them. So he was like, oh, okay, you haven't seen. Here's a cartoon, but super adult. It's got like they're killing each other in this, or like it's got nudity, or it's got this stuff. And it's like, oh, and then it kind of like just I'm like, I didn't know you could do that. I thought you just had to have cartoon mice and that's all you could do. But like, it definitely blew my mind. It definitely was like, oh wow, and not only just for animation, but for like comics and stories. I was like, you can do like like what Akira, like with this crazy like sci-fi epic that's gorgeously illustrated. And it was kind of like a comics and storytelling like eye opener for me. So I would say I'm probably most influenced by, as comics go, by anime and manga for sure.
For example, which like I know Abby mentioned a couple, but I'd love to hear one or two from you.
Let me think. For a lot of like Studio Ghibli and Miyazaki stuff specifically, like that kind of definitely is relevant to the Prunella book that I most recently did or came out. I grew up also really loving children's books. My mom had a collection of like old children's books, like of the classics. And so I always liked that. And I always felt encouraged to not like, look down on a quote unquote kid's story, because the adults in my life like still read them to me when I was growing up. So I like that kind of mystique and fantasy. My mom used to read me Lord of the Rings growing up. And I wasn't even really aware of Ghibli or Miyazaki till like college when Princess Mononoke came out. I think that was the first big one that would like hit my radar. I was very vaguely aware of Totoro, but it was a big deal when Mononoke came out, and I didn't see it in the theaters in New York, but I know it was like a big thing. It played in a bunch of indie theaters in New York. It was kind of a big deal. And that was kind of like, I'm like, oh, wow, this is like a fantasy, but it's unlike any fantasy I've ever seen or ever, I've only had seen like Western or fantasy influenced fantasies. And I now know that Mononoke is very, Japanese and Eastern influenced, but it was really cool. I'm like, oh, that's a completely different take on a fantasy, like a European fantasy. It's cool. And in like probably, I'm forgetting, maybe like 13 or so years ago when G Kids started to go around and like play the more obscure Ghibli movies before they were all on, or not before, but like, because I think Disney had put them all out. But before people were as aware of things like Pompoko or Ocean Waves and Whispers of the Heart, we would, because we all lived in New York, we would all, me and my friends and Abby, and we would go see them at the IFC or wherever they would be, and that was great to see them on the theater on the bigger screen. And just so I learned a bit about like their technique, about how like Miyazaki kind of like planned his movies via like kind of like a watercolor Bible to kind of like get the feel and the look of the characters and some of the key scenes. And that was probably a very big influence on how I kind of approached my first painted book.
I was going to say, like, because I just read Prunella, and the thing that really struck me was that you mentioned, reading fairy tales when you were a kid, how Prunella actually starts in what seems like a very European style village, then goes to a village that is very Asian, like Asian lanterns, like yokai type of thing, but not yokai per se. And it just kind of like weaves in and out of this Asian Western fairy tale kind of thing, but very definitely seems to land on the side of the Asian side. Like, I don't know. It's like, oh, okay. The Western perception of these monsters and how they treat each other is very, in the Western village, is like, oh, they're so close-minded, right? Monsters are bad. Monsters must be defeated. And then once she gets out of that land, like there was this really striking moment when like she hooks up with the skeletons who are like pirates and stuff, and they're just having a jolly old time. And then she's saying, "Hey, how do I turn back into a human?" And then the skeleton guy goes, "I don't know why you'd want to." And I thought that was so charming.
Thank you. Yeah, I wouldn't say it was deliberate, but you're right. My stories, I just kind of write them organically. And probably one of the bigger, like, just themes for me is just because this is kind of like a personal thing. And whether I was super deliberate about it or not, but like the fact, or the first time I was able to like leave my town or leave the area that I grew up in, or actually go somewhere that was like had more things for me to like see, probably like, we went on vacations and stuff, but like moving to New York City was kind of an eye-opening experience for me. Going to college with a bunch of like-minded people, but also very, very different people from very different places and backgrounds, is great. Like, I would say traveling is one of the most valuable things that I've ever done in my entire life, and going to different places, and going to places like Japan, going to places Europe and England. It's just kind of like, it's so important to like get out of your safe space, or out of your locale, and just without judgment, and just be like, okay, things are different over here, or done differently, and like I'm not going to judge. I'm just going to see, and then decide. So I think there's a bit of that for this. I'm a white guy. I've got European background, so I kind of I can definitely, I think it's I definitely have grown up with people who have biases, and I've always, even though I also am, the artist, was often thought of as kind of the weird kid, by adults from the church and stuff like that I grew up in. So I definitely have that kind of feeling. I'm like, this is something, I'm fine here, but like, I don't always quite feel like things kind of click. But then when I went to New York and found my other artists and found my people, I was just like, oh yeah. I realized what I was really missing. I realized what was really up. So this is a little bit like that, because even in the beginning, the character Prunella, she's not like, oh, I'm so upset that everyone around me is like terrible or hates monsters, without any reasoning. She's just kind of like, she's like, it seems weird, but all right, and that's just kind of how it is, but it wasn't until she, put on the cursed ring, became a skeleton monster herself, and then just kicked out of her village by all of the townspeople, who don't even really recognize her anymore. And when she interacts with other monsters in the forest, finds out they're super nice, very helpful, very different, and I thought that was just, to me, that was just like, it's just the evolution of that story. And it's like, I didn't even go out to try to make it like a, an anti-bias or, a xenophobic kind of story.
Because it's
anti-xenophobia kind of story.
Theme of the work.
Yeah, it's like it's once the story came together, I was like, yeah, obviously it's about that. But when I was first thinking, I'm like, I like the idea of like super simple fairy tales, where it's like, here's the village of the so and so's, and like in Wizard of Oz, where like now we're in the town where they have the
like the dolls.
The dolls, yeah, and I'm like, that's fun. That's fun fantasy or like fairy tale kind of stuff. But then, of course, I'm just like, well, this is, once I figured out my premise, I'm like, yeah, this is the direction it's going. And the story is kind of like just, and like the ending, which I won't totally spoil, but like, I was just kind of like writing that, and I'm like, oh, this is what the ending has to be. And that's just kind of the way I write, I guess. The story kind of goes off in its own way and kind of takes control.
Yeah, it's very satisfying, because it wasn't anything I expected, because I went into the book cold. Like, I didn't read the descriptions, and I just kind of followed the journey where it takes you. I don't think people go, well, why would this book be on Mangasplaining? It's like, well, some of it, like, you can see like some of the page turns that you do, like when the page turns, and then all of a sudden you see the dragon over a 2-page spread, or she gets kicked out, and you see this beautiful 2-page spread of her in the forest. So there's kind of this manga pacing to it a little bit, I think.
Yeah, definitely. I wanted to. This was, since I was hand painting this entire thing, I was like, I this has got to be an art piece, for me. Like, so I want to have some really nice spreads and some really nice atmospheric kind of feeling, again, like kind of like classic children's books. And yeah, I think you're right, especially with like things like Ghibli or like, trying to think, like probably like Princess Mononoke, because there's a lot of scenes that have that feel where you're just like in a gorgeous background, a beautifully painted like forest or something like that. And you're right. And also there's a part where they go to the town of the monsters. There's like the monster town Cedarton, which is in the forest. I don't know if that makes sense, but the name makes sense at all. But and she goes into what's essentially an izakaya, essentially a Japanese pub. And like that, I was able to like draw like yakitoris and like fish on sticks and a grill. Only there's just a giant blue monster who's the chef.
It's one of my favorite parts. I gotta say, like,
oh, it's so good.
I get to see, since I live with Matt, I get to see the original watercolor pages, and they are so beautiful. I really hope he gets to do an art show where they go on display, because I think his rendering of forests and the creatures and the yakitori are unparalleled. Honestly, I recommend it.
Thank you.
It's true.
I really like the rock creatures, how they cooperated.
Oh,
and
cool.
how you made them take the story forward. It was really charming. Like if I think about it, it's like that book is kind of like this great. It's like a greatest hits remix of all the best things of fairy tales from all over the world. But it fits together really nicely.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, because I'm not like I'm not the most original person. I just kind of like I want to.
You're too hard on yourself. No, it was because it did have those elements of fantasy. It had like real anime vibes, real manga vibes, but also real video game vibes. The idea that you go to the little town and have to go to the inn and you go to the whatever, and that was totally there too. The like and encountering a different, a different race with like their own customs and stuff. And that's like very Nintendo 64 era Legend of Zelda, especially to me.
Yes.
The Gorons and stuff like that. Like, oh, we're going to do rock stuff. And that's like so imprinted on me as a kid who grew up in like the Nintendo and then PlayStation ecosystems that I see that kind of stuff. But the other big theme, and it's the same, it's very Lord of the Rings as well. I'm glad you mentioned it, reading it or having it read to you, I guess, when you were a kid, is that you can't go on the adventure without the adventure changing you. And you can't go back to Hobbiton at the end. You've seen the shit. You can't pretend that things are okay anymore. And that is, without spoiling it too much, that is very much the ending of Prunella. It's like, you've changed too much to go back to your small town and to be the person that you were, who was sort of boxed in before. But it's everything from like the best fairy tales, I think, do it. The best Ghibli ones do it for sure. And I think it was present in this. And it's like, yeah, it's never immediately like, this is so Japanese, check it out. It's more like, I've grown up with all this material and like these interests and traveled the world and synthesized them back into a thing. And I think it's wild. And it has such a good, Deb and I have talked a lot about kids manga more recently, but just this idea that like kid manga is grabbing young people, like is like, there's something about it, man, but it just hardwires into their brains and it's getting more and more and more and more popular every year. And a lot of North American stuff kind of lacks the edge, like it connects with kids on a different level than manga does. There's a visceral quality to manga that really connects with them. And reading this, I was like, this is edgy. Like this is edgy as hell, but not in like an off-putting way, but in like oh, you're really like saying some stuff here about like get outside of your comfort zone, meet different people. Other people aren't monsters. You could be a monster and not even know it. Like just try and find a level. I thought that was great, actually. Really, really cool about that story.
Thank you very much.
I think that's really fun about both of your work is that in some ways it can look very simple, but there's layers to it.
Oh, yeah.
That's really interesting. Like, I want to bring it back to Abby a little bit because one thing I've always wanted to ask you about is that you won an award, an international manga award some years back.
Yes.
And that was like an award from the Japanese government and you got recognized for it. I've seen your book at the Kyoto Manga Museum. And I guess I would love to hear you talk about that experience a little bit.
So yeah, the International Manga Award it is like a super international award, as in one thing I noticed is they don't, I'm one of only a few North Americans that have gotten placed. However, I will say, in the interest of being more modest, is that I got a bronze. So I wasn't flown out to Japan to get it. However, I did meet with Japanese embassy people at a very nice restaurant in New York City, and they gave me the award, and they gave me, we did a photo, and I actually have the stuff right here by me. So it's basically kind of like a paper, certificate, and it was and a little pin that's shaped like a word bubble that says manga. So
I'm curious, like, what did the judges say about your work that made them, really take notice?
I didn't get any. It's kind of interesting because I basically just got a phone call from it, and what happened is it's for Daltopia, which is another book that came out for me from a small press. It is Green Candy Press. It's out of print, but you can get it legally through various e-book sources. So Daltopia, and it's about dolls that are tired of being controlled by humans, so they start their own society. It's like a fable about society kind of told through dolls. And also I always loved, taking my dolls and cutting their hair off and drawing makeup on them and making them all punk and putting clothes on them. And I wanted to make a book like that. But it also is about, fitting in or not fitting in society. What can you do? And it was a really fun story. And I'm really happy with how it came out. And I worked with great people at the publisher, and I was like, yeah, please submit it for this. So like the PR people at the publisher submitted it for it. And I didn't think it would happen. So then I get a phone call from, the Japan Foundation. No, I think it was from the MOFA, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Japan, that I got a bronze award. So I was like, oh my God. I was like, well, can I come to the ceremony? But they were like, well, unfortunately, we're only flying the gold and silver people. But it still made me happy. And I might have been one of the first or maybe second North American person who was named for one of these awards. I know that Ken Nimura has got one, and Joe Kelly, I think it was I Kill Giants, I think had it. But I didn't actually get any specific feedback to me about it that I recall. I think it was just, I do remember Monkey Punch was on the board, one of the people on the board that year. So I was like, well, I know who he is, so he must have liked it. So that made me happy.
I would have loved to have heard what they loved about it,
Yeah, I didn't really get any specific feedback as to why it was, but it was definitely, they have a specific board of creators and professionals that look at the work, and they change. Usually I think it changes year to year, but he was the only one who I was familiar with. And I was like, oh, Monkey Punch must have liked it.
That's
for those of you not in the know, he is the creator of Lupin the Third. He's the manga.
So that was cool. But it was really great, and I did feel very honored, and it was really nice that I actually got to meet up and feel like in sort of an official capacity, my work was recognized, and I get to visit the Kyoto Manga Museum, and they have my book there, which is very cool. And I did get to meet some other interested readers. Like there's this professor who we're friends with there, Fusami Ogi. I think I had met her through some women's comics interview I was doing with her, but she's like a real proponent of Daltopia, and she even gave it to Moto Hagio.
Wow.
She actually used it in her, this professor used it in her class and has had Matt and I actually speak in Japan at her school in Fukuoka before. So she she's a very big Daltopia fan, and she's often trying to use it in her classes, and we might, so even though it was a small press book and it wasn't a big deal in the US here, it found audiences, even though it hasn't been translated in Japan yet. Maybe someone will pick it up. It was really cool. And I felt really, especially because if people don't know my work, they won't know, but especially when I was starting out, I definitely got, my art has been drubbed for sure by mainstream fans. I mean, think of, if somebody who's used to reading superhero comics came across my mini comic, they'd be like, what is this? I definitely got, people didn't understand what I was doing, and that's fine. It's not for them. I don't really care what they think, but it was nice to have an official, we think your work is good and worthwhile, even if I felt it wasn't understood locally or by most audiences here. So it's nice.
I want to actually bring it to back to Kyoto, the series that I guess we're gonna feature, Jinrei, where it's kind of like both of
Yeah.
you together, right? Both of you together in Kyoto. Tell me more about that.
Oh,
Well,
Mac. Yeah,
Oh
yeah.
yeah.
it's manga-splaining. That's what I loved so much about Jinri. When you gave me a copy, you were like, "Oh, this," and like Abby had been doing the books like using manga to talk. Like it basically, like let's be honest, you guys are just making explainer manga at this point with under a different name because it's for North American. It's for Tuttle. It's for a North American publisher or self-published or for second. But it's like, nah, man, it's like explainer manga. It's like we're using manga to talk about things that are going on and happens to be Japanese culture. That was huge for me, both with Abby's books and then with Genri. But yeah, let's talk about Genri first then, and because you're both characters in it, sort of hopscotching your
Yeah.
way through Kyoto. I think it's sort of an amazing short story.
Thank you.
And I've been to that shrine, but I've never been at night. So that was such an amazing story.
That was that was great. So the Fushimi Inari Shrine in Kyoto is one of the more famous shrines, as you guys know. And during the day it can get extremely busy. From what I understand, I've never actually been there during the day. And I think
it's crazy.
yeah, and I think Abby was the one who I think saw in some guidebooks or someone she might have known kind of suggested either go super early in the morning or go after dark because it'll just be like less people. I think there are some slight superstitions about being in a shrine at night too. So we did that, and it was I just the Jinrei comic is a attempt for me to kind of like just get that atmospheric feel that we had when we went to it, because it was like it wasn't scary, but it could be scary. And it's the temple, it's like, you know, it's famously has the thousands and thousands of red torii gates that kind of wind up the mountain, and there are little side areas, little side shrines. Some are like falling apart. Some of them are like tons of wildlife living in them. There's those spiders are everywhere in the fall.
Wow.
Yeah, seriously. And it's like, and when we were there was still already in the beginning not a ton of people, but we didn't go to the top of the mountain, but the further up we went, the like less light there was, and it was great. But it's like at a certain point we're just like, it's a little too scary and it's getting late for us to go all the way. So I just kind of wanted to, and I also did this book before I worked on Fernella, so it was kind of a practice. It was kind of a practice piece for me, you know, just for method, to try out, you know, some materials, but also to kind of like try to get an atmosphere, because that was going to be very important to me for Prunella, and I wanted to do that for that story. Yeah, it was fun, but it's I definitely recommend going at night. It's very cool, you know, as long as you're not scared of the dark or spiders. Although I don't think they show up until the fall. So if you go in the spring, you're probably okay.
I think when there's a lot of people that the spiders are scared, or like you're too distracted by other things. But I thought it was really fun because it features both of you. And one thing that I love how you draw Abby, because she just looks so delighted at everything that gets thrown at her, like, oh, there's a cat. Oh, there's this. And it's like, it's so like it could have been like, you know, like, oh, this scary, you know, thing, right? Going up the mountain and there's spirits and there's ghosts and what it feels like. But it more feels like following you two on this adventure of curiosity. And you're like,
yeah, it's kind of like to me, it had a spiritual feeling to it, but not in any kind of religious way, not even in a Shinto religious way. It just had like a humanist kind of spiritual experience where it's like, you know, I don't remember exactly when it was we went. It was in the fall, I know that. But it was just like, it felt like an adventure. It felt like a spiritual place. It felt like a natural place. I love temples and shrines, but I always kind of lean towards shrines. Shrines are the Shinto religious points, where temples are Buddhists. And they're both great, and they both can have an incredible atmosphere. But just it's an older religion, and it's like a very different religion. And it's like, there's something that to me, like, it just completely like figures into Japanese old folk tales and folklore and yokai and that kind of mysterious feeling. And like, you know, not to like, I'm not Japanese, so not to like fetishize it or anything, but like I do love that mythology. I've always loved mythology of different cultures, so it's a little bit of that. And it's just, there's nothing like that in North America. There's just nothing that old. So in the US, so it's just great to be at places like that.
I've had a couple weird moments at shrines as well, where things like you turn a corner at a shrine and it's like busy because you're in Tokyo or Kyoto and it's overrun by tourists like you, like me.
Yeah.
And you sort of turn a corner and all of a sudden all the sound drops out, just like, and maybe it's like, oh, it's a natural architecture. They built the trees there on purpose because, temples and shrines, there's lots of, events. And I mean, we went to a flea market, Deb and I, at one of them. That's where people would congregate, right? But so maybe it's like, maybe it's just natural architecture. Maybe it's just they planted the trees and built this wall in the right place and it blocks out the sound. But you sort of turn a corner and you drop, like the sound drops out and it's really serene and beautiful. And then it's like the hairs on the back of your neck stand up a little bit and you're like, why is this so different than like 5 feet that way? There's something going on here, and it could be anything. And I found that at Fushimi Inari too. Like you go just off the beaten path a little bit, and you're in like a graveyard or a weird little nook, and you're not quite sure what it's used for, and you realize people have probably been coming there for like 1,000 years or something crazy, like something that you can't even hold in your head and comprehend. So yeah, no, I feel that too. It doesn't happen very often, especially now because it is so busy in the tourist spots in Japan. But if you get off the beaten path, for sure, it's something that's really magical. Abby, what were you going to say?
Oh yeah, I just was going to say I am pretty sure I recommended we go there at night because I like to pre-plan a lot, so I was like searching on like online message boards and things about planning our days in Kyoto, which was also kind of tight. So I was trying to say what's open at certain hours, and I did see the thing about Fushimi Inari, and they're like, well, it's open all night. I guess it doesn't close, and it's illuminated. And I love illuminations. I mean, it's not like it's illuminated like really bright all over the whole thing, but it's lit. So it was definitely kind of like a mysterious adventure to get there, and it was dark. But I really was not. I was expecting more people. Because we weren't there that late. I think we might have been there. It was a bit after sunset, but we got there and there were very few people. So like we didn't, so it could have definitely been like an eerie feeling. And I felt like the illumination was very green on all of the beautiful statues of all of the foxes. And so many of them, I love them so much. And I love looking at, and they each had different faces. Like they're all in different styles. So I could spend a really long time just going and admiring each different face and each different fox. Some of them were dilapidated and falling over. Some of them look newer. It's really all kind of like a jumble of a lot of fox statues, in our, so.
There's a lot of years.
So there's something
history.
Just that, and that's like not even, getting into the Torii gates and the many Torii gates and the beautiful cat we met. But you have to read Matt's comics to see it, the whole story.
We have good news, actually. Matt is going to let us run Junri on Mangasplaining Extra. So if you're listening now, the comic will be up. You can go to mangasplainingextra.com, our newsletter. You can read it on the website, but if you subscribe, that'd be cooler. So, and it's a free subscription. So yeah, Matt, thank you so much for letting us run that. That's going to be really fun.
Oh, of course.
And you get to experience Matt's fantastic watercolor painted artwork. Yeah, I was surprised actually when you told me you were going to switch to watercolor because your style is so graphic, and you're like, no, I'm going to do this. I'm going to whatever. I didn't realize you'd gone to school to do illustration and watercolor painting, and then like did everything except for that for like 10 years of comics making.
Yeah.
The watercolors are really gorgeous. Like I was saying, unparalleled. Like I know we're married and everything, but I don't really know anyone else who does better watercolor. Forrest, that's right. It's a challenge.
Wow.
I don't know anyone else who's better.
I wouldn't agree with that. But there's a few of us, but there's some excellent watercolor artists, comic artists out there.
But can they draw forests and beasts roasting yakitori as well as you?
Well, thank you.
Probably not.
And another cool thing too, at the end of the Jinrei comic, I did a bit of an explainer about some of the interesting things that you see at a Shinto shrine, and I want to do more of those. It was really fun. We're just kind of like, hey, if you ever wonder, you see those pieces of paper, like what they are, what they're called, and what they're for, or like why is a Torii Gate called a Torii Gate, and that kind of thing. So it's kind of like as like a follow up to the fun narrative, then having like a little comic about explaining some stuff.
Yeah, that was neat. That was really thoughtful. I was going to say, because like now that Japan has opened up, Christopher and myself, you have been to Japan several times. What's your number one travel tip for people?
Number one
travel tip. You start, Abby, because you do the planning.
Yes. So like I think it was mentioned, but I wrote 3 books about Japan, 2 of which are travel guidebooks. Well, I'd say my number one tip is actually to constantly keep checking the websites again and again, because I like to use Japan-Guide and Tokyo Cheapo. I feel like .com. They're both pretty up to date on certain things, especially with what's been going on with all the changes. And in May, they're going to be changing things again for entry, which I think is going to make it even more loose, but obviously more hopefully simpler to get in. But things just are changing a lot all the time. I actually feel a bit bad when people are tagging me that they bought Cool Japan Guide and they're like, I'm about to go to Japan. I'm thinking, oh my God, that book came out in 2015. And I really hope that you are checking how to enter Japan and what the current JR Pass situation is, because I cannot do anything about it right now. But yeah. We do have the opportunity to put updates in. That's what I learned doing travel books. Nothing stays the same. The Gundam statue changed at least once since I drew the Gundam statue in the first edition of the book. The JR Pass, it was also gone for a while. And then I just feel bad for the folks who didn't look that up before they went. I'm like, I'm sorry, I couldn't do anything. It's a book. But we do try to put updates in as we can. And I actually, since this trip, because of things that have been really different with Japan entry and also with the JR Pass, which to Matt and my disappointment had a total downgrade. It is not a beautiful folio anymore. It is a little green ticket. And you really don't want to lose that ticket, and you have to stick it in through the turnstile slot to get in and out of the train. So
it's a little bit more convenient because of that, but it's terrifying if you're like, this thing looks exactly like all my other tickets. This has cost us over almost $300. If we lose it, they will not replace it. So
they will not.
It's like, I wish it was made out of something like plastic.
Yeah. So my number one tip is definitely to, well, first of course, buy my books. But the other thing is you have to keep on top of online exactly what's going on with the entry procedures and with the transportation options, because they are always changing. And there's there isn't always a rhyme or reason. We don't really know why I can guess why they changed the JR Pass that way. It probably made sense in certain ways, but it doesn't make a good souvenir anymore. It's easier to lose it. But I don't want to take up an hour talking about what the deal is with the JR Pass, but go to tokyocheapo.com and Japan-Guide and you can figure it out. But I will say it is no longer a beautiful folio. It's now a little green ticket and you don't want to lose it. So just guard it with your life if you buy one.
I would say if I was to give some advice for a first time a traveler to Japan, to visitor, one is obviously, learn a bit of the basics of the language, but don't stress about it, because especially if you're going to be in Tokyo for this first time, it's much more English friendly than you might expect for a very different language than English. But even other parts of the country are pretty English friendly nowadays, the cities at least. And I would say it's a very safe country, so don't be afraid to just explore. And one of the most gratifying things is to stumble upon a shopping street in a random neighborhood, or to kind of stumble on a cool area that has some cool shops or restaurants. You do your research, but some of the most fun I've ever had in Japan is just wandering. What's the name of the town is near Mount Fuji?
Hakone,
I'm sorry. Hakone, we went to Hakone, and it was the first time we were there in spring, and we were there with Yuko, Abby's friend Yuko again.
Hi, Yuko.
They went to a cool themed onsen, kind of a very interesting, and that just wasn't my thing. So I'm I'm going to go just explore. So I just took different trains down to different parts of the areas. I kind of wandered around. I wandered to the other side of the river where people just live, and I found a couple temples or shrines over there, and it was just wonderful. It was just like I ran into a lady who used to live, a Japanese woman who used to live in Ohio in America. And she showed me at a temple, she showed me this like hidden like garden behind it. That's like a Kyoto style garden. It was like, I would never have seen it. I would never have known where that was if I just didn't randomly run into her. It was great. Like, just kind of wandered around, just took my time, and probably did some sketching too. That's stuff I really love, little quiet moments, and when you don't totally have a plan.
It's good. That's all very good. Yes, totally. And I did have some hot tips, actually. I just thought of like newer hot breaking news hot tips.
Oh, exclusive.
Well, one was that for the Ghibli Park, which still is very hard to get tickets to, and it's not totally clear exactly the best way to get tickets unless you do it way in advance and are part of a lottery for a lot of people. However, JTB, which is the Japanese travel agency,
Bureau, right?
they used to sell Ghibli museum tickets standalone, which they don't anymore. But you can get Ghibli museum tickets in packages with JR Pass and with hotels through JTB, right? But they also, it's not on their website, but if you want to get if you want to go to the Ghibli Park, you email them through the website and ask them, and they are selling Ghibli Park passes with hotels in Nagoya. And I found this out because I was considering it. So I just found like the contact us part of the link. And I was like, so by the way, are you selling Ghibli Park tickets? And it's only to the warehouse section of the Ghibli Park. Yeah. There are like 3 sections, but there was only one. But it's still better than not being able to get in, which is what will happen to you if you go to Japan and just try to show up at the Ghibli Park. So I feel like if you're trying to make a plan and you want to go to Ghibli Park, though it sounds to me, it's really more of a photo opportunity, kind of a park situation. There are no rides, so it might not be for everybody. But there's already some YouTube walkthroughs if you want to get an idea if it's worth it for you or not. But
also, if it gets more people to visit Nagoya, I think it's okay,
Nagoya is awesome.
An underrated. We were talking about this. It's an underrated town. It's a city, and we really like it there.
Misakatsu.
Yeah.
Nagoya is definitely awesome. So people should do that anyway. If you want to go to Ghibli Park, absolutely. I think it's worth it to contact JTB and get a ticket along with a hotel room at Nagoya.
I think people have asked me like, oh, why do you go to Japan so often? It's like, because it's like playing a video game. Every time I go, I level up a little bit and it gets a little bit better and a little bit better and a little bit better.
Yes.
And I make slightly fewer mistakes and I get braver about going
That's true.
to other places. And
you put points into your language skill. And so you like can language your way through things better.
Yeah.
It's a good metaphor.
That's a great way of putting it, Deb. Yeah.
Yes.
I definitely agree.
And the other hot tip was, which I did get to do this time, was they opened an onsen, a rooftop onsen attached to Haneda Airport. So if you want, when you arrive to Haneda Airport and you're tired and you want to go and have an onsen experience, there is a very nice onsen spa as part of the new airport garden, Haneda Airport Garden, which is like a big shopping and hotel complex, walkable from Terminal 3. These are hot tips, hot off the press. I recommend.
Awesome. Chris, any other questions for Abby and Matt?
Yeah, I was thinking about something we said back at the beginning, and it was the idea of discovery. And I was just listening when working on the show notes for the Tokyo Scope crossover episode that we did with Matt Alt and Patrick Macias's podcast. And we spent a lot of time talking about formative experiences on that podcast for like our secret origins as well. And it's just this idea of like, digging through crates or like finding a magazine and finding stuff listed in the back of the magazine. And for me, being a young, queer person, it was the same thing for manga as it was for like gay shit. It was like you sneak downtown and buy an XY magazine and look in the back to see like, what are other zines? And like, oh, who's this Abby Denson person? Maybe can I find them online maybe? And like that kind of stuff. But it was the same thing for manga where like I bought a Comics 1 manga, and a defunct manga publisher, first to publish in Geo in English though. And in the back it would list these other manga that they had that were digital only, including like shonen ai manga, and I'm like, oh, I've heard of that. I didn't know there was anything in English. And you can sort of like, if you like follow Internet Archive Wayback Machine links, you can find what they had at the time. And it's just this act of, it feels like archaeology, but it's present day. It's like you're trying to discover this thing that's outside of yourself, that's outside of your experience. And I wonder, because you're both like, you both traveled to Japan, you've written books, like Abby, you've written like 3 books on being in Japan, Japanese culture, and then like manga and anime, video games and stuff like that. Do you ever feel like you did back when you first started trying to discover this stuff and trying to figure it out? Like we just talked about having leveled up quite a bit, but do you ever get that like, oh man, I just trumbled onto something completely new and I'm diving in and I don't know anything about it. I'm still trying to figure it out. Do you still feel like that? Do you still have that sense of discovery?
With everything you have on your plate, earning your degree online seems impossible. But at Grand Canyon University, we specialize in helping you fit a master's degree in business into your busy day. Your graduation team, led by your own GCU counselor, provides you with the personal support you need to succeed. Achieve your goals with a plan and team behind you. Find your purpose at Grand Canyon University. Visit gcu.edu.
I think with certain things, again, I'm also like a big like movie fan and into B movies and stuff. So, but I'm definitely not an expert on Japanese cinema, but I know what I like. So like when I find certain things I like, and a lot of it, like I really find like these old like 60s and 70s. Like I really love The Black Lizard. I think it was Black Lizard 1967, 1968. Like certain movies I find that I'm like, oh, I need to find more of these. So I think with cinema, I need to dig in more. But one of the things I'm getting more intrigued by that I have zero knowledge in, and I probably don't even know what I'm going to do with it. But when you're in Japan now, there are a lot of very beautiful vintage kimono and kimono fabric and obi and things like that for so cheap. And it's so beautiful, the fabric. And I can't sew, and I'm not really into wearing kimono like as a habit or anything, but I just really loved I bought a bunch of the fabric just because the patterns were so nice. And it just seemed a shame, and it was so cheap. And I think it's because I'm guessing the population's aging out and the young population doesn't really interested in the art kimono anymore. But just seeing that craft work is just, it's worth it to me to be like, yes, I will buy all this fabric and take it home. And now I have a bunch of, but I know there's a whole world there if I want to like dive into.
Yeah, I know exactly what you're saying, Chris. Like for I think it's like at different stages, because we've been going to Japan for over 10 years together. And there are just certain, you just kind of, sometimes you just discover either it's a pop culture-y thing or like a nerdy thing or a culture thing. And you're just like, oh, I got to go down the rabbit hole and really learn about this and then try to look for them when I'm there. I think probably because we hadn't been able to go there for 3 years, I think it's almost a little bit like starting from scratch for something new, at least. I think I could totally see myself like being one of those train spotters there, like a train otaku. Yeah. Like there's a couple of it. We watch NHK World and I've talked to you about this, but like they have many awesome shows that can really kind of show you different cool aspects of Japanese culture. And they do have a train show. And I'm like, oh yeah, I still don't know much about it, but I could totally get into that. But like for things that like, I definitely like, the more you go, the more you kind of learn what to look for. One of my favorite things is looking for souvenir stamps and like adding it to my notebook. And when I first kind of like was researching about that, it's just like, train stations often have them. Stamp rallies are a thing. They can be completely random. And so you always just got to keep your eyes open. And the JR line, every single JR station in Tokyo has a stamp. And they changed them. I don't know when they changed them, but since the last time I was there 4 years ago, they changed all of them. So they're all new.
It's another hot tip. The JR line, a new stamp rally.
Yeah. And retro video game collecting is a big one for me too in Japan. Like, the first time we went there, I went to Akihabara and I found this incredible little retro Famicom and all video game stuff, Japanese video games, that was just like small store, floor to ceiling, just old video games. It was just like so cool and so great. It may still be there. I didn't go there, but it's completely not like it used to be. And then I started like researching about it. And like at the time, it's a very different scene now. And partially probably because of people like me, you know, Westerners started collecting. But like they, for a long time, still kind of not too expensive or difficult to kind of collect a lot of those old games. The old Japanese
not anymore
ones.
though.
But it's not as bad as it's not as bad as the North American video game collecting scene. Actually,
oh really?
It's
okay,
still,
that's good.
It's still not as but it's like there are things that you know, unfortunately, like you used to be able to like get a lot of the old stuff just at a junk store, you know, at junk shops or like Book Off or Hard Off. And you can still find those things there, but they're usually harder to find or more expensive. But that I kind of like saw all that. Like I was able to get some really good things before it became much more of a collector's market.
Another thing I like to get too is I really like to get cheap figures like from Tokusatsu. You know, I like these Ultra Monster figures, and I like to get you know, any kind of like kaiju figurines that are, especially the brightly colored ones. And I remember we were in Sapporo a while ago and we found there was like a giant hobby off there, and I bought like 10 of them because they were probably like $3 each. They were used and they weren't in the boxes, but I really didn't care because I just am like, look at the pretty colors, look at this monster, I want it. So I just got all these monsters, and then like they're in my studio, you know, because I just really love the designs, and especially the ones that have like really garish, you know, like I have a hot pink monster here. You know, I just love it when the colors are really intense, and when it's like a really like funny looking monster with like the eyes bulging out and it's not even really scary. Like there's the aesthetic of it is amazing. And that's another thing where I'm like, I did look up the names of some of them, but I'm like, you know, I don't need to know, but I know it's there for me. If I want to like go hard and become a hardcore like kaiju fan and know what the name of all of them are and like what year the toy was made. I know Matt Alt is into toys. Like I know listening
you
to
just
his,
send him a photo and be like, what is
like,
this?
Matt,
and
what
he'll be
is
like, here's 1,000 words on what that is, actually.
But yeah, so and I appreciate that because I think it is wonderful to love and be obsessed with your like art, and I do consider it an art, whether it's like pop art or whatever. I think that that's one of the things that's so inspirational about, you know, even us all talking now and like what Matt and I do and the friends we have. I feel like a lot of the friends I have are there because it was putting out your art sends up a signal that other people can recognize, and then you can reach each other.
So bringing it back to comics for a sec, the other thing that it reminded me of was Deb's been like super getting into Korean webtoons lately, and like rabbit hole diving like into like this whole new world of comics to her. And like, Deb, does that like bring that same feeling of discovering manga when you were like it was manga was always around, obviously when you were a little girl, but like suddenly realizing, oh, this is a thing that I can like really get into? Is it like the same kind of feeling there?
It kind of is, because it's the more I get into it, the more I realize how much I don't know compared to how much I know manga, right? Like I don't know the history, I don't know the influences, I don't know who the publishers are, I don't know, you know, what is this thing about them being in studios? What's this thing about like how the Korean economy basically decimated the entire print industry, so now it's mostly digital. There's all these things that, you know, as soon as you start asking questions, it's like there are more questions and more questions. And it's given me a kind of a new empathy for people who, I don't know, like who come up to me and ask me questions about manga and manga publishing and stuff like that. And then, I don't know, sometimes I'll end up like explaining stuff. And then people go like, wow, that was a TED Talk, huh? And it's like, wait, don't you know all this shit? It's like,
yeah.
And so it's kind of like, so I guess to bring it back to the webtoon thing, it's like comparing it to what I know about how the Japanese publishing industry works and how manga's created and who's the influences and what makes it what it is. And then I see hints of it in Korean webtoons. I don't know why.
Mm.
And so like I'm finding myself, now all of a sudden I'm the one asking the dumb questions like, wait, so why is this like this? And how come it's like that? And wait, why does this character all of a sudden get weird looking? You know? Or like, why is all the shonen stories about guys getting bullied? Like, huh?
Yeah. That's a weird one in Korean webtoons. It's just like every single one is like
And they're
hardcore
super
bullying.
violent too. Like, right? It's a high
Yeah.
school story, and the kids are getting beaten up like crazy in high school. It's like, wait, what? How much? So, somehow it's like with manga, right? Where it's like, Japanese high school really like this?
Is Korean high school like this? Everyone getting the crap kicked out of them every week? Like maybe.
To this
I
day,
don't know.
I don't know. But it's weird, right? Because you kind of come to, like, your books, obviously, Abby, like your Japan books come from a sense of curiosity and love. But it's also kind of an introduction to a new world, right? I mean, what kind of feedback have you heard from readers who've read your books, or what they get out of it?
Yeah, I get a lot of positive feedback, and sometimes I get fan letters written by children. Sometimes I get emails from parents of children who got it and were like, my kid really loves your book, and we went to Japan and they had such a good time. And so I really like that. But yeah, usually I get feedback about how it made them feel more comfortable, and that I guess that it has a friendly interface. It's like a friendly kind of vibe of the book. It's not just like a text travel book where you might feel it's dry or kind of just like throwing a bunch of facts at you, whereas mine is a bit more personable because it has myself and it has Matt as a character in it, and it has my friend Yuko, who we mentioned a few times as characters, and my character Kitty Sweettooth, who is a character in it. So it has characters that are going through the experiences along with you or showing you things. And I think that can make it much more of a friendly read than a, bare bones travel guide.
Yeah.
And it's written from my experience.
I actually love travel guides. I have before I moved to this side of the world, I actually had a huge collection of them at like 2 shelves, including all of your books. And I do want to, let's talk about Kitty Sweettooth just for a sec, because I think it's wild, actually, that people are not like more talking about it, because you partnered up with a Japanese artist, Utamaru, doing like a kid's sort of fantasy adventure series based on this character you've had for a while. And like, it doesn't look like anything else. It's such a wild situation. Could you talk a little bit about how that partnership came together? Because Utamaru is not like a mangaka, right? They're like an illustrator, animator.
Yeah, Utamaru does illustrations, designs, and very recently did the anime character designs for the Mute King anime. The Mute King, the Dancing Hero, which is a reboot of I believe a Tatsunoko anime. And it is fun, so fun. It's on Funimation. Please watch Mute King. But it's like a dance battle, sci-fi dance battle anime. It's my best way I can explain it. With rollerblading or roller skating. Roller disco dance battling. Anyway, so I was in Tokyo and wanted to go to this bar, which was themed after the horror movie Suspiria, and the bar is called Cambiare. So I went with some people, and I ended up just randomly meeting Utamaru among other people who I am now still friends with that I met that night. So we met there, and we just sort of were keeping in touch on Facebook, and I knew I really liked her art, and Matt and I both really admire her art. And we also met Miyako Kojima there, who also has a book coming out in English from Starfruit now, which is cool.
Oh, cool, yeah.
Horror manga, right?
Well, yes.
The horror manga.
Yeah, I met them both in the same night.
Amazing.
Yeah, yes.
Hanging out in a Suspiria bar. That's awesome. That's very Japan. Love that.
Yes.
And Kaneko was with us too that night.
Yeah.
Oh, really?
We're name dropping all over the place.
Atsushi Kaneko.
Oh, Atsushi Kaneko.
Yeah. We went with Atsushi
so
Kaneko.
Cool.
Yeah. Yeah, he's amazing. Everybody check out his comics.
He did a Bambi and Her Pink Gun.
Yes.
And a couple other books that haven't been licensed in English yet, but he's an amazing artist.
Yeah, he's spectacular.
I hear he's going to have a new book in English soon, actually. Dum, dum, dum.
I can't wait.
Yes.
Anyways, I met Utamaru randomly at this bar. And then we kept up a friendship. And when I wanted to make a Kitty Sweet Tooth kids book, and I wanted to try to collaborate with other artists, and I wanted to make a pitch for it, and I thought, who would be like a dream artist? I thought, what about Udamaru? So I contacted her and thought she said she was interested. So I commissioned her to do some, sample pages and character designs with me for the pitch. And then the pitch ultimately went through and we got a 2-book deal with First Second. So it was Kitty Sweet Tooth as the first book, and then Kitty Sweet Tooth makes a movie. And the story is about a cat and it's actually semi-autobiographical. People who know me will know. So it's about a purple cat, of course, like me, who loves B-movies and desserts, and collaborates with a witch and a not mad scientist to make magical food, basically, that goes crazy during these B-movie screenings. First book is about that. And then in the second one, Kitty Sweet Tooth wants to direct her own movies. So she directs a movie with her friends, and it's like a globe-trotting adventure with like a transforming vehicle. So they're both these like really wild kind of psychedelic books. And Udamaru is an amazing artist, an amazing character designer. Please check her stuff out. I will say R.A.P. Mondo, but she did some amazing posters for Mondo. I have her Return of the Living Dead poster on my wall right now. It's like amazing. So she's a real genius. I'm surrounded by genius. I'm really lucky. I've got Matt here. I get to work with Udamaru. How lucky am I? So I think the lesson is just, dream big and ask for what you want. Hopefully you'll get to do it and do the work, make the mini comics, show people your ideas, But I really hope people find it because both of those books came out during pandemic. So it was really difficult to sufficiently promote them. The Kitty Sweet Tooth book. So it's a real bummer.
Have you guys considered podcasting instead? Because people just pick these things up during the podcast. It's real wild, actually, how people listen to them at all, actually. So it's great.
Yeah, maybe. But yeah. So, but I really recommend it. Check out Udamaru. It's been a real dream working with her. So I'm really happy. But with how these books came out, I think they have a really positive message. And my understanding is the kids are loving them. So I'm hearing the feedback.
Oh, that's nice. Yeah. Cool. Well, I think that we're probably a little over even, but I want to do a thing that we usually do when it's just David and Chip and Deb and I podcasting, which is final thoughts. Even though we're not having a final thought about the book, we've had such a lovely and wide-ranging conversation. I thought I would offer up final thoughts to everybody. So everyone, what are your final thoughts on this lovely conversation we've had today? Who wants to go first?
Well, I'm just feeling grateful. I feel grateful to be surrounded with, like I said, surrounded by genius and with great friends, and get to talk to wonderful people like you. I'm like a fan of the podcast, so it makes me, and a fan of you as humans before you did the podcast. So I'm really happy we get to have this conversation. And
cutting all this out.
but I do think, like I mentioned, I think art is a way that is something that can connect everybody globally. And if you show your signal, if you put it out there, then it will bring like-minded individuals to you. And that's really like a magical thing about art.
Matt, how about you?
My final thoughts, and again, thank you for having us. We both love this podcast, and you guys are great. And we've learned about a lot of different mangas because of the podcast too. Yeah, I would say for me, similar to what Abby was saying, just being an artist, it can be such an isolating job sometimes. It's just kind of wonderful that we've been able to kind of use our art to go to conventions, but also go to international conventions and meet international artists, not just in Japan, but also Europe. But we've been so fortunate and lucky that we have actually met, and become very good friends with different comic artists in Japan and different other visual artists. And it's like, as different as the cultures can be, I feel like there's just that unity of artists. There's just something about an artist's kind of way of thinking that, like, there'll still be differences and differences of perspective, but like it's just a unique relationship between, I think, artists, even that kind of supersedes, national borders. And that's one of my favorite things about going to Japan is seeing our friends, our artist friends, and meeting new people and meeting other new artist friends. And and also one of my favorite things is meeting other, people who are like us, who are either North American artists of origin or European, and then meeting in Japan, because we all love Japan, like Ken, or like we met at Atelier Sento from France. We met them in Japan last trip. And my favorite is just kind of like, expanding the circle of friends, of international artists and comic artists and manga artists, and our appreciation of Japanese culture.
That's really cool. Deb, any final thoughts you'd like to share with the class, with the group?
I would just say, like, what I've really enjoyed about our talk today, and I'm of course watching, your ventures from afar, is I appreciate both of your sense of adventure and your sense of openness and discovery, like sense of wonder and discovery everywhere you go. Your love of what you take in, what the quiet moments and the busy moments. You go off the beaten path. You make yourself open to new experiences and new people. And that's just delightful to see. So it's always so much fun to see your travel diaries and see how it comes out in your work. So that's been really nice.
That's really cool. Yeah, I mean, I should probably be nice as well, but I'm not going to. Like, I like you both, don't get me wrong. But the thing you said like a little while ago about discovery, I was thinking about what was the last thing I actually totally didn't know about Japanese culture that I discovered while I was there. And it's through my friend Gary. Hi, Gary. I know you are listening. Thank you. Who is a puzzle guy. And he really likes puzzles and like does competitive puzzling and things like that. And he's like, oh yeah, Japan has like a huge, crazy puzzle culture. That is the thing that I dip into outside of manga and food when I go to Japan. And I found out that every year Tokyo Metro, the subway station, not the subway system, in Tokyo, not the JR trains, like the JR Pass, has a puzzle that you like buy for like $20, and you complete the puzzle by figuring out clues and going to different stations on the Tokyo Metro system, because the clues are the station, and then in the station is the next question and the next clue. And they've started doing it in both Japanese and English for tourists. And it's this like crazy ass thing that you'll see posters for in the Metro. They do it at the end of the year every year. That I know. I walked by these posters saying, join our like special Tokyo Metro like puzzle quiz situation every year. And just like blanked out, because like there's, I don't know, 500 posters in any given Tokyo Metro station. But like, yeah, that's one of his favorite things to do when he goes to Japan every year, is to do like this year's Tokyo Metro puzzle. It's like so exciting for him. And that's mind blowing. Like, not only does that exist, but there are like puzzle and quiz leagues here. There's puzzle box culture, which is huge in Hakone, is like a traditional handicraft that I didn't know about. There's just all this stuff that's like, oh, I would never have known that if I didn't have a friend who was super deep into that thing. And so you realize that like, and then quite honestly, moving to Taiwan and realizing that like there's so much to discover and so much to like, not discover, Columbus, let's say, in like there as well. Whenever you go somewhere, there's so much to learn about stuff, about, and hopefully about yourself. And that's actually been like, yeah, I guess it does get sappy and come back to you guys. It's like making friends who have these passions that like just differ from yours and bring sort of different things to the table. And you're like, oh man, there's so much to learn about so much. And it's awesome. It's really, really awesome. And that, yeah, like that's the best part of like having these passions, is sharing them with people and maybe like learning that there's more to the world than you thought there was, which is really wild. And my final thought is Abby's living the dream, because anyone who goes to Japan gets to ask for advice on what other people should do in Japan when they go. And she's like, actually, I wrote a book about it. You can just buy that, and I don't have to give you advice anymore. And that's like the dream for Deb and I, who are like constantly approached with, what should I do in Japan? How do I make the rail pass work? And it's like, buy my book. I'm not talking about this anymore.
I literally said this today. I literally said this today to a guy at the Verizon store. I said, he was like, "Oh, I want to go to Japan." I said, "I wrote 3 books about it. You can look my name up and buy it online." Well, I give him some advice, and I said, "But you know what? I wrote 3 books about it. Just look it up on Amazon." And also, I also recommend Japan-Guide and Tokyo Cheapo pretty often because I feel like those are pretty consistently updated. but yeah, I say that more than you would think. So please, everybody, write your own book about Japan, and then you will have the feeling I have. I get to do it. I get to say it several times a week, I'll tell you.
Well, this has been an episode of Mangasplaining Extra. Thank you. Sorry, this isn't Mangasplaining Extra. This is Mangasplaining Listen to Me as our talk show segments. I totally forgot. Maybe David will overdub it. Maybe he won't. Maybe he'll just put the shoujo sound effect over me messing up the name of my own our own podcast at the beginning of the episode. This has been Mangasplaining Listen to Me. Thank you so much, everybody, for listening. We will be back next week with Deb. It's oh no, this is going to run after. Never mind. I don't know what's going to come over. Listen in the outro. We'll tell you what's coming next. Thanks so much.
It'll be magical. We promise.
Ready to level up your career? Text DISH to 44043 now to dive into a world of exciting technician opportunities at DISH. From cutting-edge technology to a supportive work environment, DISH offers the perfect platform for your success. Connect with us today to discover how you can be part of a dynamic team driving innovation. Connect today and join the DISH family, where innovation meets opportunity. Text DISH to 44043 to kickstart your journey towards a rewarding career.